Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos a la Biblioteca Pública de Coral Gables. Mi nombre es Alicia Godoy Giró. Yo soy la presidenta de NACAE. NACAE significa la Asociación Nacional de Educadores Cubano-Americanos. Y hoy estamos aquí y nos acompaña el comité ejecutivo de NACAE, el doctor Federico Justiniani, ex oficio, Lourdes Sayas Bazán, vicepresidenta, Eduardo Sayas Bazán, tesorero, Yossi Valdés Hurtado, secretaria, Jorge Giró Puyán, vicetesorero, y Daniel Pedreira, PhD. Bueno, también contamos con la colaboración de Wenceslao Cruz, que es nuestro profesional de videos, de YouTube, de fotografías, y esta entrevista, esta conferencia y todas las conferencias que damos en NACAE siempre se pueden ver en vivo y después más tarde en YouTube y quedan ahí ya puestas, así que siempre la pueden volver a ver otra vez. NACAE es una organización sin lucro dedicada a promover la educación, la cultura y los valores cubanos. Cada año, nuestra organización lleva a cabo el Premio Educador del Año, otorgado a profesores de habla hispana que se han destacado por su excelencia, experiencia y dedicación. También tenemos la beca Gastón Fernández de la Torriente, que concede $2,000 a un estudiante hispanohablante que se gradúa de la escuela secundaria con buen rendimiento académico para continuar estudios de español a nivel universitario. Nuestra programación cultural mensual incluye conferencias literarias, musicales, artísticas. Todas están basadas en mantener la cultura cubana en nuestros corazones. En los meses de julio y agosto no vamos a tener eventos, pero volveremos en septiembre 4 aquí a la Biblioteca Pública de Coral Gables. Invitamos a todos aquellos que han sido educadores o que tienen interés en la cultura cubana a unirse a NACAE. Las solicitudes de membresía están disponibles con una cuota anual muy razonable, $25 por persona o $30 por pareja. En la tarde de hoy tenemos el honor de presentar la beca Gastón Fernández de la Torriente al estudiante escogido por la solicitud, las buenas notas y la composición que presentó. El doctor Federico Justiniani va a presentar al becario. El doctor Justiniani se graduó de la Universidad de La Habana en el año 1954 de medicina. Y después, cuando vino al exilio, estuvo en el hospital Mount Sinai desde el año 64 y después fue profesor de medicina de la Universidad de Miami. Fue profesor de medicina interna de la Universidad de Miami. Hoy el doctor Justiniani va a presentar a Liosvani Aguiar Lorenzo de Hialeah High. Y ven con su mamá. Ven.
A los miembros de la Junta Directiva que
Sí, Yossi, Jorge, Lourdes.
Gracias, Alicia. No sé si se oye.
Tienes que acercarte.
¿Se oye ahora? ¿Se oye? Sí, perfecto. Ok. Gracias, Alicia, por tu presentación. Para mí es realmente un honor y una satisfacción poder presentarle la beca Gastón Fernández de la Torriente a este joven Liosnavi Aguilar, ya que él, en primer lugar, a mí me escogió el comité ejecutivo porque él parece que tiene el plan de estudiar medicina y por eso tenemos algo en común, de manera que me siento más identificado todavía con el joven, aunque nos separan unos cuantos añitos de diferencia. Pero los años que he vivido, que no son pocos, me han enseñado que en la vida uno tiene que tener metas a largo y a corto plazo. Y yo estoy seguro que Liosvani ha tenido esa intención de tener la meta primera que ahora en este momento está alcanzando, que es el haber graduado de high school en Hialeah School. Y la segunda meta que él tiene ahora en mente es hacer un bachelor's en Miami-Dade County y College, y más tarde ir a estudiar medicina a FIU. De manera que yo lo felicito por ese plan. Yo creo que está formidable, y aunque no creo que lo voy a ver cuando ya sea médico, pero estoy seguro de que va a tener éxito en su carrera, igual que ha tenido éxito durante su high school. De manera que con mucho gusto le voy a presentar al joven la beca. Además, antes que se me olvide, quiero referirme a su familia. Aquí en este caso está su mamá. Estoy seguro que ellos han tenido una gran parte en el éxito de su hijo, porque el ambiente hogareño es muy importante en cuando el niño se desarrolla en los primeros 5 o 6 años, y esto logra que el carácter de la persona sea un carácter enjundioso, un carácter que lograr sus metas. De manera que yo felicito también a la mamá de Liosvani. Bueno, entonces vamos a dárselo ahora. Liosvani, aquí te presento la beca.
Muchas gracias.
Y te felicito por todos tus éxitos. Te invito si quieres decir algunas palabras.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Liosvani Aguilar Lorenzo y es un gran honor para mí estar hoy aquí. Quiero comenzar expresando mi más sincero agradecimiento a la Asociación Nacional de Educadores Cubano-Americanos por otorgarme esta beca. Recibir este reconocimiento significa mucho para mí y para mi familia. Su apoyo no solo representa una ayuda para continuar mis estudios, sino también una motivación para seguir esforzándome y perseguir mis sueños. También quiero agradecer profundamente a mi familia. Hace 4 años salimos de Cuba, huyendo del régimen cubano, en busca de la libertad, oportunidades y un futuro mejor. El camino no siempre ha sido fácil, pero gracias a los sacrificios, el trabajo y la dedicación de mis padres, hoy puedo estar aquí celebrando este logro. Ellos han sido mi mayor inspiración y el ejemplo de perseverancia que me impulsa a seguir adelante cada día. Me siento especialmente orgulloso de haberme graduado de high school. Me gradué con honores, ubicándome en el top 5% de mi clase. Gracias. Este logro representa años de esfuerzo, disciplina y dedicación, así como el apoyo constante de mis maestros, amigos y familiares. Cada desafío que enfrenté me ayudó a crecer y me enseñó la importancia de la perseverancia y el trabajo duro. Mirando hacia el futuro, mi meta es convertirme en cardiólogo. Quiero dedicar mi vida a ayudar a los demás, cuidar la salud de las personas y contribuir positivamente a mi comunidad a través de la medicina. Espero que mi historia pueda servir de inspiración para otros jóvenes inmigrantes que, como yo, llegaron a este país buscando una oportunidad para construir un mejor futuro. Una vez más, gracias a la Asociación Nacional de Educadores Cubano-Americanos por esta oportunidad y por creer en estudiantes como yo. Su apoyo tiene un impacto que va mucho más allá de lo económico, inspira esperanza, abre puertas y ayuda a transformar sueños en realidades. Muchas gracias a todos.
Bueno, primero que nada, vamos a reconocer a todos los miembros de Pedro Pan. Que se levanten, por favor. Fantástico. We're going to continue this presentation in English because we want this to be in the internet, and we want as many people as possible in the United States to be aware of Pedro Pan and what it meant. So it is my pleasure to present to you our two presenters today. First one, Victor Triay. He was born in Miami in 1966. His parents had fled Fidel Castro, Cuba in 1960. He was raised in Miami and graduated from Christopher Columbus High School in 1984. He obtained a BA in history from the University of Florida and an MA and PhD from Florida State University. He began teaching history at Middlesex Community College in Middletown, Connecticut in 1992. And in 2001, he was awarded the Samuel Proctor History Prize by the Florida Historical Society for his book, Bay of Pigs, An Oral History of Brigade 2506. Triay's historical work primarily explores the Cuban exile experience using a combination of traditional historical narrative and an oral history. In 2005, Triay teamed up with Ted Baboon and co-authored Cuban Revolution, Years of Promise, a photographic history of the Cuban Revolution. The Arizona Journal of Hispanic Cultural Studies called it an exceptional, significant contribution to Cuban history through the power of photography. In 2013, he published a historical fiction trilogy, The Unbroken Circle, consisting of Book 1, The Struggle Begins, Book 2, Freedom Betrayed, and Book 3, On Freedom Shores. In addition to that, Triay is the historian of the Bay of Pigs. He has written extensively on the Bay of Pigs, and we are very grateful to him for the work that he has done on the new museum and all the previous work that to make the Bay of Pigs known and its true history. The other presenter is Carmen Valdivia. She came from Cuba through the Operation Pedro Pan at age 12. Today, she chairs the Pedro Pan Museum and serves as a trustee of Operation Pedro Pan Group Incorporated. She's a Florida registered architect. She produces the documentary Operation Pedro Pan, the Cuban Children Exodus, and is associate producer of the upcoming Pedro Pan film. Carmen is Emeritus Executive Director of the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora and the proud mother of 2 sons and grandmother of 4. So without anything else to say, I invite Victor first and then Carmen.
All right, thank you, Eduardo. Wait, something happened to my PowerPoint here. Hold on, let me go back up. I'm not good at talking and syncing it with a PowerPoint, so I might just talk and show the PowerPoint later. Too many neural pathways already set and unable to change. Again, every time I give a talk, either on the invasion or Pedro Pan or Mariel, I always consider the audience and what they might learn. And so I cut a lot out because there's a lot of this history that probably 95% of you in this room already know. And so I decided to focus in on one area that maybe most people recognize, and other parts that maybe will be new to you. So, but anyway, my book on Operation Pedro Pan was my first book. It was originally my doctoral dissertation. At the time, the timing was perfect because at the time hardly anyone knew what Pedro Pan was. What? Oh. Very few people knew what Operation Pedro Pan was at the time. Operation Pedro Pan Group had only started a few years before, so there were press articles. There was a growing awareness, but there was no book on it. So after I got my PhD, I sent it to a publisher, the University Press of Florida, and lo and behold, to my shock, they published it. And it was the first book on it. I never thought they would, but they did. Again, I was very young. I was still in my 20s when I wrote it. I was just a child. Now I'm morphing into an old man. But anyway, I think the number one thing that people need to understand, and people on the outside, is exactly what was happening in Cuba that prompted this. And a lot of you lived through it, so this isn't going to be news for you. But nevertheless, at the beginning, when Castro took over, it was a great triumphal moment. There's going to be a restoration of democracy and elections, and the dictator is gone. But almost right from the very first days, anybody watching closely can easily see there's something else going on. From the day he got to Havana on January 8th, the elections are postponed. Political parties are abolished. Don't worry, they're going to be restored soon. We just need to clean up a little bit and create the environment, right? Anybody watching closely would have known this isn't going to happen. But he did surround himself with democratic figures, so that gave people some comfort, but launched into almost, and again, you have to look at this from the point of view of psychology, right? I mean, history, politics, yes, but psychology. Almost from the very beginning, from the very first days, a terror campaign was launched. A very public terror campaign was launched, right? You had the trials that were public trials of basically, these Roman circus type trials, which had never been seen before. The executions broadcast on television. Again, all of this, I believe, having studied other dictatorships and having studied many before Castro's, it was to create a spectacle, to shock people, right? Because when people are shocked, they pay attention. When people are shocked, they draw near. People like power. People have never seen anybody with this amount of power before, where they could just order a trial, where they could execute people on television. It was very impressive, right? Impressive to those who were horrified by it, and impressive to those who were supporting it. But even those who supported it, underneath all of that was a message. This is what we're capable of. This is what this new government is capable of. We can destroy you in 2 seconds. and you have nowhere to hide. So even if you were supportive at that moment, I mean, the message was, listen, in 5 years, if you're against us, remember this moment, right? And that impression, I think, set the tone for everything that happened later. Of course, you know, people who truly believed in democracy gradually began to fall away, especially after the famous aviators trial. And then, of course, we see the democratic figures gradually purged from the government, the rise of known communists, anti-US rhetoric, Castro criticizing people who criticized communism, because that was one of the first steps. He didn't say he was a communist, he continually denied it, right? But strangely started to criticize those who criticized communism and started elevating communists. By the fall, many former supporters had fallen away, even some major figures from the rebel army or rebel armed forces, Diaz Lanz from the Air Force, Uward Matos from the rebel army, etc. And by the fall, many of the pro-democracy people who had been part of the revolution entered an opposition. In 1960, a lot was done indicating totalitarianism, and there was a lot of fear. The spreading radicalism, as far as Pedro Pan is concerned, youth organizations, young people being armed and dressed militarily and marching. These things that create a spectacle, the things that come through the eye and get recorded in the brain and get interpreted in the brain and get stored there, right? It was all done to instill fear, right? And these weren't events happening on TV. Like today we say, oh my God, I'm so scared because there's this, you know, political movement or whatever. But really you just experienced it in your living room watching TV, not in the flesh. This isn't the flesh, this is looking outside and seeing this. And if you're a parent, you're starting to get terrified, unless you happen to be, you know, part of the Castro cult at the time. There was reason to believe schools might be closed at some point. And the schools, the private schools, particularly the Catholic schools, were becoming almost the last bastion to protect children. But they were still open in 1960. But in 1960, February, Anastas Mikoyan shows up, right? Cuba begins the process of entering the communist orbit. We see the media, all of the press taken over in no time, in a matter of weeks and months. Television, print, radio, all taken over by the government. Literally in almost no time at all. You even see other places that have dictatorship, you know, 10 years later, there's still some independent press they're shutting down. In Cuba, they did it thoroughly. The newspapers, magazines, radio stations, television stations, all within a few months. And then all the messaging that anyone received was coming from the regime, which of course by now was a full-blown dictatorship. The labor unions were forced to cede control to communist leaders. Religious persecution at churches. Private property, especially in the fall of 1960s, private banks, several businesses confiscated by the government, professional associations, etc. It was clear what was happening. Also in the fall of 1960, we see the creation of a revolutionary militia, right, distinct from the army. I think they were a branch of the army, but there's a difference between a militia and the army. And again, in most dictatorships have a protective layer from the army, because all these dictatorships fear their own army, right? The Nazis had the SA and then the SS. Castro builds the militia, and then later, of course, state security, which already existed. They just referred to it as the Hero. We see the creation of the CDRs, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, starting to go up on every block to surveil the entire population. And suddenly, everyone's being watched all the time for what you say, for what you do, and you know the consequences, because by this time a lot of people were going to prison and were being executed who had nothing to do with Batista whatsoever. They merely opposed the Castro regime, they were pro-democracy, and people know they weren't advertised on television, right, because that wasn't good politics, but you knew it was happening. And you knew that these people could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and there was great fear. And of course, many Cubans started to leave, right? Those who were directly targeted or fell into a category that was being targeted begin to leave. And many of them left out of fear of what would happen to their children, right? And I think it's important to establish about Operation Pedro Pan. I think the overarching thing here is that many, many thousands of families wanted to get their children out of Cuba for fear of what might happen. we'll never know the number, but many thousands left with their children, right? The Pedro Pan kids were the ones, right, whose parents wanted to get them away, but the parents, for some reason or other, couldn't leave. But if you look at the number of children whose parents took them out of Cuba, and you include when entire families left or they left with relatives and didn't go as unaccompanied children, the number would probably be 10 or 20 times what Pedro Pan was, right? Of course, some families couldn't leave with their children. We start to see the unaccompanied children leaving in late December. And there were several reasons parents couldn't leave. Some had sick relatives, some had relatives in prison. But nonetheless, probably the biggest reason was the matter of exit documents, which we'll get to in a little bit. Remember, the U.S. Embassy, almost right after Pedro Pan technically started, which was in late December 1960, the first unaccompanied children arrive. Within days, the U.S. and Cuba break diplomatic relations. And as we're going to see in a little while, the first Pedro Pan kids came with student visas, et cetera. Now there's no way to get a student visa, right? But a program was developed, which we'll see in a minute, that made it easier for kids to leave, right? Easier to leave than adults. And so that's where it really gets started. But the end of diplomatic relations had a lot to do with it. But in 1961, things became very real. Again, like I said, the break in diplomatic relations made it so that there was no conventional way to get documents to leave the country, or at least to come to the United States. And that was a big blow, and it's going to have a big influence on what happens. Unaccompanied children begin to trickle out in the first part of the year, including a lot of children of members of the underground, right, who didn't want their kids being seized as a means to get them. Also in early 1961, they announced that it was going to be the year of education. And this was huge. What does that mean? It left a lot of people wondering. In the meantime, what I call the trifecta. On April 15th, the opening bombings occur for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Happened 2 days before the actual landings. Castro gives a speech, and for the first time, and he'd been in power for 2 years and 4 months at this point, he announces that he's a socialist. He uses the word socialist. After denying he was a communist for all that time, later in the year, he's going to describe himself as a Marxist-Leninist. So it was out. Also, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Everybody was waiting for an invasion. Everybody knew something was going to happen. There was going to be a moment of truth. Things were starting to turn in Cuba, and then the invasion happens, it fails, and that was made an enormous difference. Because even in Pedro Pan, before the Bay of Pigs, you could count the kids in the hundreds. After the Bay of Pigs, Pedro Pan exploded. Also, with the Bay of Pigs invasion, that's the year that the government announced that all the schools in Cuba would be closed, and a new school system would be reopened. This included all the private schools and all the Catholic schools, which would never be allowed to reopen. And like I said, for many parents, the last bastion to protect their children from being absorbed into this totalitarian madness were the schools. Some were allowed to open after the invasion just to finish the school year. Some closed with the invasion, like Belén, and never reopened. So that was the trifecta: the announcement of socialists, the invasion, and the closure of the schools. And the closure of the schools was part of the year of education. But perhaps even more influential, and this is something I think where you really see the strategy, the tactics of communists, was the famous literacy program. We are going to teach people how to read. What's greater than that? What's more humanitarian? What is more virtuous than teaching people how to read? How can you possibly criticize that, right? And that's part of the packaging. But what was it really about? Well, Cuba already had about an 80% literacy rate, which at the time was very high, especially in the region, and it was growing, and literacy programs had existed before Castro, because I know people who worked in them, right, well before Castro. Because in reality, the literacy program was not about the illiterate. The literacy program was about the volunteers who would carry it out. And the government launched a program. It was the first mass mobilization of people in Communist Cuba. And who were the volunteers? Largely young people, teenagers, right, who were recruited, who were pressured, who were whatever, to join these literacy brigades and spread out across Cuba and teach this supposedly semi-literate country how to read, when of course 80% already did. And it was about them, it was about the volunteers, to separate them from their parents, put them under the authority of hardcore revolutionaries, communists, away from their families, bring them into this vortex of revolutionary enthusiasm, of communist indoctrination, and by the time you give them back to their families, they've become little robots, right, of the revolution. And the parents knew that. They knew that. And of course, you could be very cynical about this too, because a year earlier, the Cuban regime had taken over all the media. Everything that people read, right, was taken over by the government. The government completely controlled what people read. Now they're going to teach people how to read? I mean, was that to facilitate propaganda, or what was it for? And I've been very criticized because I've criticized this program. And again, the reaction is predictable. How could you criticize teaching people how to read? Well, it wasn't about that, but they're very good at that. They're very good at packaging things that in a soundbite culture, right, you come across very negatively for criticizing it, but you need at least 30 seconds to explain, and people don't think that long. And I think the Cuban regime knew that, right, and they always did things this way. And of course, the thought of, you know, their kids being separated from them, taken out Lord knows where by God knows who, put into what kind of an environment, how would they come back? A lot of parents said no way, and didn't send their children. In fact, when the new school system opened, and the new school system was run by the regime, it was designed to eventually create the revolutionary new man and new woman, a good atheist, worshiper of Fidel Castro. A lot of parents kept their kids home, right? And they hid them, they educated them at home, and there are a lot of Pedro Pan kids, probably some people in here who were there long enough for that, whose parents, kept them home, not just from the literacy brigades, but also from the new school system. There were rumors that all the kids were going to be sent to Russia, that they were going to be sent to the Soviet Union. The government did send, like about 1,000 of them to Russia, which got very well advertised, and it's like, oh my God, they're going to send our kids to Russia. Which of course, they didn't send the Cuban children en masse to Russia, but Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, was brought to Cuba. And I think that's a very important point. They didn't have to send them to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was brought to Cuba, right, and implemented there. There was also a rumor of patria potestad's parental authority over their children, that the government was going to announce a decree removing parental authority over their own children, and that the state would now become the parent. And although this was a rumor and it never happened the way people imagined, that they would legally lose custody over their children, but in a way, in a de facto manner, they did lose it. Parents did lose it in the future, because that patria potestad was shifted in a de facto manner to the state. When parents have no choice how to educate their children, when religious institutions are removed, when those who remain religious are persecuted and denied opportunities, career opportunities, educational opportunities, right? When the government sets the expectations of the individual to be successful in life by following the line that they set, right? And where the parents cannot interfere with that, you know what? You've lost patria potestad, at least to a very, very large degree. Like I said, when Pedro Pan started, it was generally speaking people who wanted to get their kids out, but who couldn't leave themselves. Either, like I said, they either had elderly or sick relatives. Some still own some property, right? I mean, the government didn't take everybody's property all at once. Some people still held some, and some people were like, well, and remember, people leaving Cuba weren't leaving to emigrate. People were leaving temporarily to go back. Everyone was convinced the United States was not going to allow a Maoist dictatorship 90 miles from its shore. And the fear was, if I emigrate from Cuba, they confiscate all my goods. And then when Castro falls and I come back, am I going to be able to get it back? So let's hold out a little bit longer. They had relatives in prison, But again, like I said, especially the closure of the U.S. Embassy created a situation where parents were able to get their children out at a certain point before they were able to get out. But let's look at that. And I've reduced this down to the bare bones. How much time have I taken? If you start getting bored, throw stuff at me and I'll stop. But anyway, let's go to Miami. And look at this. I'm not even doing my thing. Democratic provinces, the trials, Communist Bloc. They're the youth organizations. You see the kids there with the guns and marching. Religious persecution. $5 for whoever names that person. 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. That's Carmen. I had to put her in there. She told me if I didn't put her in, I couldn't do the presentation. No. This is, of course, the expulsion of clergy. You see the famous Coalonga ship there, where a lot of clergy. All right, let's talk a little bit about Brian Walsh. Walsh was a young priest in his early 30s. He was born and raised in Ireland. He attended seminary at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, which happens to be the oldest Roman Catholic seminary in the United States. He ended up in the Diocese of Miami, and at the time he was the head of the Catholic Welfare Bureau. The Catholic Welfare Bureau, everything in Miami was, of course, on a much smaller scale than it is today, obviously. Miami wasn't as small as a lot of people think. They said, oh, there was nothing here. Well, yeah, there was like 900,000 people in the county, but anyway, but it wasn't as big as it is now. But Walsh, as the head of the Catholic Welfare Bureau, was in the circles of local social services. And he was witnessing a growing crisis in the social welfare situation because of the arrival of Cubans. And of course, when you left Cuba, you had to leave everything to the government. What, you could take $50 and 3 sets of clothes. That was it, right? And nothing had happened to him yet until November 1960, when a teenager, Pedro Menendez, was brought to his office, right? His parents had sent him here to protect him from, communist brainwashing. He went from relative to relative, eventually ended up on the street. Someone brought him to Walsh, and Walsh took that as an indication of things to come. Oh my God, with all of this going on already in Miami, I've been waiting for this, and now it started. And there's probably going to be more Pedros being brought to my office. Now, in the meantime, the locals here in Miami, of course, were not pleased at all with the arrival of Cubans and settling here. So they created the Cuban Refugee Executive Committee and petitioned the White House to send somebody to provide aid, relocation, advice, etc. And so the White House agreed to send a representative. In preparation for that visit, Father Walsh, he wasn't Monsignor yet, it's still Father Walsh, called a meeting of the Child Care Division of Miami's Welfare Planning Council. These were the heads of different agencies that provided aid to children locally, private agencies, right? And he gathered them from the Child Care Division, and he said, look, this guy, someone's coming from Washington. His name is Tracy Voorhees. He handled the Hungarian refugee problem. And Walsh came up with a plan. He presented it to this group, which they approved of. Walsh wanted to make sure that that any children who showed up were provided for, but that federal money would be used. That would secure funding. That would eliminate any funding problem, right? The federal money would be used, and that federal money would be given to private religious child care agencies to take care of any Cuban children who showed up, right? Whether they were Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, etc. The money would go from the federal government to those private religious child care agencies, and that the kids' religious heritage would be protected, right? So if they were Jewish, they go to a Jewish agency. If they were Catholic, which of course 90% were Catholic, went to a Catholic agency, etc. And they all agree. So eventually, Tracy Voorhees is sent from Washington. He studies the situation. He opens the first version of the Cuban Refugee Center and provided $1 million. As far as unaccompanied children were concerned, we met with Walsh, and in the final report it said, well, money will be provided for unaccompanied children if the need exceeds the ability of the private agencies to provide for these kids. Okay, great. So Walsh now is set. Okay, if more than so many kids show up, the federal government's going to send money. Now I just wait till they start showing up, which he was convinced eventually they would start showing up. Well, that didn't last very long, of the waiting for them to show up. Because meanwhile, in Cuba, right, there was a school, I'm sure at least a few of you went to Ruston Academy. Any Ruston graduates? There you go. See, I knew they were Ruston graduates. Yeah, they're Ruston students everywhere. Anyway, the head of Ruston Academy was Mr. James Baker. Baker was the headmaster. He and his wife basically were the owners of Ruston. It was an American school in Cuba. Baker at first was very enthusiastic with the revolution, and of course very quickly was turned off by it, and with the turn to communism. In Ruston, he had connections to the growing underground network against Castro by 1960. And so being connected to the underground, right, he knew what was going on. And there were several members of the underground, or potential members for the underground, who said, listen, we'll participate in the underground, but we want our kids out of the country. Because then they go after our kids, and if we're undercover in hiding, they're going to use our kids as hostages to get to us. And plus, there were other children that Baker knew of whose parents wanted to get them out of Cuba. So Baker, in November 1960, or in December, goes to Miami with a plan. And that was to solicit money from the heads of U.S. corporations who had previously been in Cuba, who'd gotten kicked out, secure money from them, and open a temporary boarding school in the United States, probably in Miami, for these 200 or so kids, right, that he was going to provide for. Somewhere along the line, someone tells him, you need to talk to this priest, Walsh, because he's, concerned with kids too. So the two men meet for the first time. Walsh persuades Mr. Baker to drop his idea of a temporary boarding school. He explained to him, look, if unaccompanied kids come in, we have the promise of federal money, okay, and he described his whole plan, what I just explained a few minutes ago. And he explained that only licensed child care agencies should take care of the kids because they could provide total care, the religious issue. And of course, Baker was thrilled because Walsh had solved half his problem, right? Which is, what do you do with the kids when you get here? Problem solved. And so they came up with a plan. Baker would go back to Cuba, right? Send Walsh lists of kids, and then Walsh would secure visas, student visas, through Coral Gables High School. Money would be provided just in the very beginning by some of those business people, which would be channeled through the W. Henry Smith Agency, right, to Cuba. Because to get out of Cuba, you were going to need three things, right? You're going to need a plane ticket, a visa, and of course, a seat on a plane, which, as many of you know, were very difficult to get at that time. So now Walsh's role expands. Walsh's first plan was just to probably sit in the Catholic Welfare Bureau and wait for these cases to show up. Now he's actually participating in an effort to bring the kids out and securing visas and sending visas, at least a plan, in the diplomatic pouch to Havana, etc. So Baker leaves, this is already December 1960, goes back to Cuba with visas for like 25 children. And now it was a matter of waiting. Walsh wasn't sure what to do, right? What am I going to put these? I mean, the Catholic Welfare Bureau only had 80 kids, right, under its responsibility. This was going to grow from 80 to 14,000 very soon, right? He had no idea at this point that was going to happen. Assumption Academy, which used to be down there with Brickell around there, was out on Christmas break. So Walsh talked to the sister there, to the nun, seeing if they could stay there. She said yes. He never mentioned that there would be boys among these, and just didn't say anything. They had St. Joseph's Villa in Miami, so at least he could solve the short-term problem. The first arrivals finally arrived on December 26. 2 kids showed up, sent from Cuba, not local children who had been brought to Walsh, but the first ones to actually show up. By December 31st, there were 22 children. Walsh formally asked for the money that had been promised to him. Meanwhile, none of the children had showed up with the student visas. They all had other kinds of visas. Like, well, what happened to the student visas? And it was very difficult to talk to people in Cuba. Walsh is told to call Frank Auerbach of the Visa Division in the State Department. He talks to Frank Auerbach, who's going to play a role later, and he says, look, the thing is, our embassy in Havana needs someone to take ultimate responsibility for the children. We need a statement of ultimate responsibility. Can you give us that and send it to us by courier right away? It's the kind of thing you did before there was email. Okay, and Walsh had to decide on the spot. He didn't have time to consult the bishop. But he said, yes, I'll take ultimate responsibility. He sent the letter, and it was off. But really, it didn't make a huge difference at this point because diplomatic relations were severed days later. Mr. Baker returns from Cuba within a short time after the embassy closed, and it seemed like it was all over. But it wasn't. Because Mr. Baker had left behind at Ruston a secret committee to continue the effort to get the children out. The members of this committee, and there were 5 principal ones, the plan was, first of all, this committee had connections to the British Embassy, and this committee had connections to KLM Airlines, the Dutch national airline. And the plan was, again, there were still flights between Cuba and the U.S. That's one of the ironic things. After the break in diplomatic relations in January 1961, there were still commercial flights between the U.S. and Cuba until the Cuban Missile Crisis in October '62. But anyway, since they couldn't get documents to go to the United States, these contacts would secure visas for the children to fly to Jamaica. Jamaica was still a British possession, so they needed a British visa to travel to Jamaica. Right, the British Embassy was open, they could get the visas there. There were 2 weekly flights from Havana to Kingston. One went directly from Havana to Kingston. If they were on that flight, Walsh very quickly is going to go to Kingston, meet with the diocese there, make sure that they cooperate. They agreed, right? So if the kids were on that flight, they'd go to Kingston and then spend the night. The next night, go to Miami from Kingston. The other flight went Havana, Miami, Kingston. If they were on that flight, when the plane got to Miami, they just get off the plane. And that was that. So Walsh then has to call Frank Auerbach again at the State Department to get his approval on this. So he calls Frank Auerbach. Frank Auerbach invites him to Washington to meet with him. Walsh was going to a conference there anyway, which of course he ended up not going to, and he says, great. So he meets Auerbach in Washington, D.C. on a rainy Sunday afternoon when nobody was on the street, right? It was all very, cloak and dagger type thing. Walsh explains the Jamaica plan to him. Basically, it sounded good, pending British approval, right? So it was approved. They asked the British are going to come back and say, fine, you can do it. But then Auerbach presented to Walsh something that, if you really look at it from a certain point of view, was shocking. There was something called the visa waiver. Visa waiver is something that was supposed to be rarely ever used in emergency situations only. It needed like congressional approval and all these things, right? It was not an easy thing to get, and it was a 1 in a million, but it was on the books. It was legal. And in fact, the door for Cubans to come into the United States until at least the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be visa waivers. The United States is going to end up issuing over 400,000 visa waivers to Cubans, right? These emergency waivers of a visa requirement, which are supposed to be used every blue moon in emergency situations. It was a way to keep the door open. And probably many of you came on visa waivers. But visa waivers weren't easy to get. You had to have a first-degree relative in the United States petition for one. It cost money. You had to send them to Cuba, etc. But what Auerbach proposed to Walsh was to give Walsh blanket authority for his Catholic Welfare Bureau on his letterhead, right, Catholic Welfare Bureau letter, that he be empowered, that he be authorized to issue visa waivers himself. Blanket authority for any children between 6 and 18 years old. If they had a letter from the Catholic Welfare Bureau with Walsh's signature, that counted. This is from a private agency giving visa waivers, right? Never, just unprecedented. So the question was, now, would the Cuban government accept that? And of course, they did. Anyhow, Walsh is going to just end up, according to him, sending maybe a dozen visa waivers into Cuba with the name of the child blank and his signature photocopied, right? And then they were reproduced by printers in the underground in Cuba and distributed. And all the parents or whoever issuing it had to do was fill in the kid's name. And that was that. And the Cuban government accepted that. And again, they knew what was going on. They had their own reason for letting this happen. But nevertheless, so in time, most of the children will come on these visa waivers, the vast majority. Some came through Jamaica, some had other types of visas. It wasn't exclusively visa waivers, but that was the big one. And most Cubans coming at the time, in general, were coming on visa waivers as well, but the regular visa waivers, right? The ones that someone had a petition for them, etc. Anyway, we're going to start to see networks inside of Cuba operate to get these documents to people. Again, they had to get the exit documents to the children whose families wanted to send them. They needed money to purchase the tickets, and they needed seats on a flight, which was very difficult during that time. Visa waiver networks emerged while the Catholic schools were still open. That was a major network. In fact, when many schools were closed and they were shut down, the parents were given visa waivers, like on the spot. Underground networks, clergy, former politicians. Also, there were programs to create phony visas for travel that were made. Sometimes a person could place a visa waiver for a child in Cuba with the airline in Miami, Pan Am, KLM, and they would have it in their files, and they would send a little note to their offices in Havana saying, such and such a child has a visa waiver, right? And then that little card was enough to get out of the country. There were people in Cuba who worked for the airlines, I know one, with the authority of their boss, would create those letters as though they were from Miami. Such and such a child has a visa waiver. And that was accepted as well. Anyway, the Baker group included, just to listen very quickly, Francisco Finlay and his wife Berta de la Portilla, who were, of course, connected to Rustin. Francisco, or Pancho, was the general manager of KLM Airlines for Cuba and the whole region. He was able to secure spaces on KLM flights, approved some of those false statements, etc., and of course had contact with the British Embassy. Sergio Hiquel and Serafina Lastra, friends of the Bakers, very involved early on, part of that committee, running messages, distributing visa waivers, British visas, and of course Penny Powers, who was British. She was a teacher at Ruston. She had formerly worked to smuggle Jewish children out of Nazi-occupied Europe, and used her connections with the British Embassy and in private schools to do it. Later, after the Bay of Pigs, is when the Graus became involved, Mongo Grau and Polita and their networks. But there were hundreds of people at all levels, diplomats, teachers, clergy. We'll never know the number. We'll never know the number. Just very quickly, am I out of time? Or no? You don't know? Okay. I'm just going to say, just very, very briefly, after Kennedy was elected, Abraham Ribicoff was made the Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It's going to be then that the new Cuban refugee program was created. Walsh made it so that the Cuban Children's Program, which was the program to care for the children, was tied to the Cuban refugee program because it would be funded, or funding guaranteed. The money flowed from the child care, from the Children's Bureau of HEW to the Florida State Department of Public Welfare to the private agencies. And the private agencies were subcontracted by the state of Florida. Again, Walsh's Catholic Welfare Bureau, the Children's Service Bureau for Protestants, and the Jewish Family and Children's Service for Jewish children. But Walsh's goals were met. The children's religious heritage was protected. licensed organizations were used, and public money was used. Again, Walsh is going to end up establishing temporary camps in Miami, almost like transit centers, because when this thing took off, you didn't know how many kids were going to show up. He was able to rely on a network of the National Conference of Catholic Charities. I believe it was 35 states, right, dioceses in 35 states across the United States that offered care, everything from group homes, boarding schools, orphanages, to take the kids. So the kids would come in, they would go, they would be picked up at the airport. They were told to ask for George, which of course was George Walsh. Those kids who had family here went with family. About half the kids had family here. Half the kids entered the Cuban Children's Program, taken to one of the transit centers, and then probably from there be given a beca, which meant a placement somewhere else, either with a foster family or in a school or whatever, all across the United States. There were permanent Miami homes established, especially for the teenage boys, and most of the Pedro Pans were teenage boys, right? There's also this image. Again, the Cuban government had for a while just complete freedom to say, to define Pedro Pan. That was a kidnapping, that these parents were fooled by the CIA. Again, the Cuban government had to explain, why is it that these normal middle-class families are so desperate to get their children out of Cuba? What's so bad about the revolution? The revolution's good for children. And if these were normal people, they must have been fooled. They must have been in the wrong frame of mind. And this was all just a CIA operation to confuse parents, et cetera, et cetera. And then you also see, their images of it sometimes, all these young children. A lot of the Pedro Pan, like 75% were like from boys from 12 above, right? Because of the military draft, et cetera. But they were also the hardest to place. So Walsh established 2 homes in Miami, permanent homes for teenage boys. Again, we don't have time to get into it or into the individual camps. I think I'm out of time. But anyway, eventually, when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, commercial flights ended between the U.S. and Cuba, and that ended Pedro Pan. It didn't end the Cuban Children's Program, though. Children stayed in care until they were 18. Some of the parents were able to leave, but a lot of them weren't able to leave until the Freedom Flights, which started on December 1st, 1965. And parents of unaccompanied children were given priority. And so a lot of, the reunions happened, but some of them took 3, 4, 5 years of separation. Some kids, 2 months. They left in April of 1961, and their parents left in June of 1961. So it all varied, and the experience varied based on age, where you were relocated, if you were relocated, and we really don't have time to get into that. But I think the legacy is very important, and we're always fighting to preserve that legacy, because unfortunately the Cuban government decided, it was really funny, and this is just total luck. I learned about Pedro Pan through my brother. He said, well, why don't you write your dissertation on Pedro Pan? I'm like, what's that? Right? And I did. Right? I was in my 20s. I was just innocently writing it, not knowing that the Cuban government was going to launch this full-scale assault on Pedro Pan, because it was an open field. There was hardly anything written. Left-wing groups like the Maseitos and the Areitos had written stuff about it, and they wrote stuff like, well, for the Cuban children, there was really no difference at all whether they were sent to camps in the United States or camps in the Soviet Union. And you're like, what is this? But there wasn't much written, but they were getting ready to publish a book. They had people here who cooperated with them, getting ready to just jump on Pedro Pan because no one had done it. They didn't even know I existed. Why would they? And all of a sudden, my book gets out before theirs does, and I'm not competing with anybody. I don't even know any of this is going on, right? But their view is that, again, that this was a giant CIA manipulation, et cetera, and nothing could be more false. If you study Communist Cuba and the fate of the youth in Cuba, especially those who weren't with the system, that'll tell you everything. So the parents were prophetic, the parents were right, and in fact, I would argue that what happened in Communist Cuba was something active for the youth, was actually something even worse than what the parents imagined. But we don't have time to get into it. It's Carmen's turn. All right, so let me go through my pictures. There's Miami International Airport, there's George. These are some of the camps, the transit centers, Florida City. You're in that picture, aren't you? See Carmen. There are 2 pictures of Carmen in my PowerPoint. I got to go in.
So I don't have to talk.
I got to go in and edit it. I have to go in and edit it. There's St. Raphael Hall, one of the permanent homes, Jesuit Boys Home, etc. Okay, Carmen, this is now yours.
Okay, where?
And also, I think you have to X out of mine. Right, Ben?
It doesn't matter. I don't need. Leave it. Leave it.
Wait. Oops.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Sure?
It's okay.
Ben, I think it's down here. There you go.
Yeah.
See?
Okay.
Always
How do-
solving problems for
How
you.
do you do the whole thing? Yeah.
Okay. Here, and so you have to hit here.
No. Okay. Okay. I am supposed to apply what he said about. I am supposed to apply everything he said about Operation Pedro Pan to my personal experience, and first I would like to introduce our board, the Operation Pedro Pan Grouping Board. Dr. Javier Llorens is our president. Carmencita Romanach is our immediate past president and vice president. Dr. Graciela Andrich is our second vice president. Olivia Gonzalez is our treasurer. And we have Gerardo Sims, who's also a trustee of the organization. And of course, Victor Tria, who's also a trustee of the organization. Okay? If I had to describe my life in Cuba, my childhood, I would say that it was almost perfect. I had a beautiful family. We were four. My late sister, Isa, my father, my mother, and myself. On my father's side of the family, it was a very large family. My father came from a family of 11 brothers and sisters, and we were a very close-knit family. I had tons of cousins, and it was a very happy life. On my mother's side, I also had 2 aunts and cousins, and we were very close on both sides. There was, of course, Victor talked about the problems, political problems in Cuba and the Batista dictatorship, but since it was an autocratic dictatorship, it really didn't affect the life of his child. So I was kept away from all that was happening, and it really, my life was perfect, as I said. By late 1958, it did touch me because I was born in Santa Clara, Cuba, and the war for the revolution was in my backyard almost. If you looked to the front of my house, in a block and a half, there was the Obras Públicas building, and Che Guevara stationed himself in there. And if you look through the backyard in my house, it was a tren blindado. And so we were caught in the middle of the Batista planes bombing the area, and on the ground we had Los Rebeldes. So we were in the midst of the war. And so my life started changing, and of course, my father had an experience with Che Guevara when he was there, because he was sending people, pointing guns and telling them to do things that were dangerous. And so my father decided that, when the revolution triumphed, Che Guevara did a walk, a celebratory walk through my neighborhood, and my father told us that we couldn't participate because I was an evil man. So even with that in the background, knowing that Che Guevara was an evil background, there was still that hope that, the 1940 Constitution would be reinstituted, that we would have elections and all that. But within a few months, he started seeing, as was said, the summary trials and the executions and all that, and we were seeing it on TV. So within a few months, we know that it was a change for the worse and not for the better. My father's hope would be the invasion, that the invasion would triumph. We all had our papers ready to leave the country if it wasn't successful, but he thought that would solve the problem. Of course, on the day of the invasion, my father was taken prisoner along with so many Cubans there was a raid, and he was put in prison, and then after prison he was under house arrest for a long time, and so he couldn't leave as they were planning. And so they decided that my sister and I would leave. There were a few things that made it imperative for us to leave. One was
one of our neighbors who had a farm about 45 minutes from our house, and they came to the house because their brother had been, 17-year-old brother had been taken prisoner, and he was accused of putting Cañaveral on fire. And so we got on the car, we got there in 45 minutes, and when we got there, he had been tried, executed, and buried. And I'll never forget the trail of blood from the place where he was executed to the berm of sand where he was buried. And that was very impressive. He was 17 years old, and there was no trial. He was just executed. And also, in school, we went to school when they, to the cathedral when they were at school. And while we were in procession, Guajiros got into the church, a truck of Guajiros got into the church, and they started with their machetes and getting in between us. So, of course, everybody was very scared, and we tried to leave through the front of the church, and there was a truck of women yelling at us and with rocks in their hands. So my mother was in the church just to try to, to see. She wasn't part of the school, but she went there because she was always going where we were going. And so we were able to escape through a side door. But it was that day my family decided that we had to leave, that it wasn't safe for children in Cuba. And so the day of the invasion was my last day of school. After that, I never went back to school. And then shortly after that, or during that time, they were nationalizing the schools and closing. I went to a Catholic school, Las Teresianas, and it taught about the lessons of Santa Teresa de Avila, which still was a great impact in my life. And so they closed all those schools, and they were closed for 8 months for restructuring education. And when they opened, Marxism was the law of the land, and education was compulsory. So my father decided we wouldn't be going to a school, not even one day, because it's very hard to undo indoctrination. So we were hiding, going to private lessons here and there, pretending that we were going to school, but it was very scary because if we got caught, we didn't know what would happen to our parents. And so it was trying times. There was the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution in front of our house, and they were always messing with us. If anybody visited the house and they didn't know who it was, they would have milicianos with arms outside. It was a very tough life. And so, of course, when our parents told us that they wanted us to come, we were in full agreement. We couldn't breathe in that type of environment. It was very difficult. The day that we departed Cuba, I think, no, I'm sure, it was the hardest day in my whole life. It was the worst experience I've ever had. And I've had bad experiences. My mother died, my father died, my sister died, my husband died. But this was the worst day of my life. Having to say goodbye to my father, a very strong man, and watching him almost crumbling to the ground. And only one parent was allowed to go to the airport, and my father decided that my mother would have that honor. And I had to say goodbye to my father in the sidewalk. And we hugged and we cried and we tried to be brave, all of us, but I could see that he was just disintegrating. So we got in the car. He had a taxi there to take us to the airport, and I was looking through the rear window, and with the distance, my father kept getting smaller and smaller, and I cannot express how sad that was for all of us. We got to the airport. We had to report to the airport at 6 o'clock in the morning, and my mother was there. She presented the papers. She bought us some sandwiches because we didn't know how long we would be at the airport. And we went into the pecera. Once you go inside the pecera, you were outside of her parents' protection, and my mother was outside the whole day looking at us and us looking at her, trying not to cry because they would say, if you cry, they take you out and they say she doesn't want to leave, or you call attention to yourself and then their body searches, stuff like that. So we stayed there all day. At some point we had our sandwiches, and then when it was time to board a plane, which was at night, from 6 o'clock in the morning, the miliciana that was checking the luggage told me that she liked my luggage, therefore she was keeping it in Cuba. And so my sister held my hand because our parents told us, your job is to get out of Cuba. It doesn't matter what they tell you, it doesn't matter what happens, you get out. So my sister held my hand and we got on the plane. Once we got on the plane, we looked out, and my lonely mother was holding a handkerchief in the balcony in the airport, and it broke our hearts. From there, we arrived in Miami, and George Warch was waiting for us. His daughter is here, Lynn Warch. Lynn? He was waiting, and we got in a bus with George. There were 4 of us, a couple of twins who was a boy and a girl, and my sister and I. I was 12, my sister was 14, the other girl was 14, and the boy too. So we went to Matecumbe. It was a scary experience because it was very dark, and my mother was always reading stories where everything bad happens in el bosque, and it looked like a bosque. And I was waiting for La Viuja Burundanga to show up at some point because it was really scary. But then George said, don't worry, this is only for the boy, you girls are going to another place. And when we got to that camp in Florida City, it was like getting a group hug, because after all the bad experiences in Cuba and the hate that we had experienced, the little boys were clinging in the chain link fence and saying hello and welcome, and it was a big group hug that I received. And then we went, of course, the cafeteria was closed, the office was closed, it was night, so they took us to the House of the Nuns, and they filled out the papers, and they gave us chocolate milk and a sandwich. And then my house mother came to pick us up, and her son is here, Manel Suarez Mendizabal. His parents were my host parents in the camp, and so they took us to the house, which would be my home, and it was full of girls my age, and they told me that they were my hermanitas del exilio. And since I showed up, I had no luggage, they started going through their 3 changes of clothes to see what they could share with me. It was such a beautiful experience to show to a place so full of love. And then, of course, I was in the camp for 3 years. And because I arrived in August of 1962, and in October of 1962, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the flights between Cuba and the United States stopped, and there was no way for my parents to reunite. And also that experience, being in the camp in Florida City was in the theater of war, because we were between Homestead Air Force Base and the NACAE missile site. So you could see everything that was happening due to the nuclear war, and we could see everything pointed at our parents in Cuba, while our parents would see everything pointed at us. It was difficult for the world, but it was most difficult for us because we were on opposite sides of a possible nuclear war. And but then in 1965, after 3 years in the camp, my parents arrived. We had a beautiful reunion, and we were close together ever since to the day that they died. I graduated from high school in '68. I married same year. 2 years later, I had my first son. Then 3 years later, I had my second son. During all this time, we started a business and raised a family. And I went to school, graduated from the University of Miami School of Architecture, became a registered architect, and life was happy until one day I remembered I was working in getting the Florida City camp declared a Florida Heritage Landmark, and so I started going through the internet trying to get information to fill out the application. I mean, the application is big, it's a book. And while I was doing that, I realized that Cuba had managed to change our history. Everything was different from what it was. Of course, they were trying to be able to, like Victor said, to explain why a parent would part with their children. And so when I realized that, I remembered that once while I was in high school, my sister with her first salary bought me a beautiful outfit to go to a football game. And when my father saw me in school colors with a hat and the pompons and all that, he goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to a football game." And he says, "Carmen, cita. The communists are planning what they're going to do in 50 years, and you have time to go to a football game." And I said, "Dad, I really can't think what I can do to fight communism, but if I ever find out what I can do, I'll do it." And so I forgot for about 48 years, and then when this happened, I thought of my father, and I thought, he cannot be resting in his grave if I allow his history and his effort and his sacrifice to be forgotten. And so I finished the application to get the Florida City camp declared a Florida Heritage Landmark. Then I started to work with Matecumbe, which is Miami-Dade County Heritage Landmark. And I started doing all kinds of things that I could teach about communism through teaching our story. Doing exhibits at museums. Carmencita and I started with a little one at FIU Green Library. People were not giving us things to show, so we used our stuff. And then everybody started getting excited and giving. We have quite a collection now. We can have, I don't know how many exhibits at the same time from the large collection that we have of exhibit items. And we also did an exhibit at the History Miami Museum. We did exhibit at the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora. We did an exhibit in Washington, D.C. at the Victims of Communism Museum. We have now, our organization is housed at the Freedom Tower, and we have a beautiful exhibit at the Freedom Tower. I also curated the exhibit that just opened at the Brigade Museum. And so those are the kinds of activities that we're having. So to tell the world how important liberty is, how easy it is to lose it, and how difficult it is to get it back. And so that's, I'd like to say something that I always say. My parents made a tremendous sacrifice. It is the biggest proof of selfless love that you could ever receive from a parent. It is not only a gift of liberty to me, to my sister and myself, but it is a gift that keeps on giving because our children and our grandchildren are able to live in freedom due to their sacrifice. Thank you.
Okay, we have a little time for question and answer. Not much. Are there any questions? Yes.
My teacher in 7th grade at Phillips School was James Powers, Penny Powers. Okay. Is it the same Penny?
I'm not sure.
She's British.
Yes.
Yeah, that is Penny Powers, the one that, yes.
And why did she stay in Cuba? I know that she participated in the evacuation of children from Germany when she was young.
Right.
Could she have been a British agent?
She was some kind of a British agent, and because she was British, she was able to stay in Cuba and stay out of trouble. She was knighted by the Queen, and she died in Cuba.
She was knighted?
Yes. Lady, yes.
I tell you, she opened a school in Cuba, which I was a teacher at, and it was called Hillside, and it was for foreign students and for children, Cuban children, first of all, when they're not being able to go to until they were forced by the Cuban government. And then, after hours, they were also allowed, as a 4 or 5, to go and take English classes over there.
She has a big role on the coming film, Pedro Pan film, which Nestor Carbonell is doing a fantastic job, and his mother is here. Where are you? There. I can't wait for the movie to come out, and Penny Powers has a big role in that movie. Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments? Complaints? No? Okay, all right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for coming.
Muchas gracias a todos por venir y que tengan buenas tardes y los vemos en septiembre para la próxima NACAE.